Have you ever wondered what secrets lie beneath the bloodiest battlefields of World War II, buried so deep that even decades of excavation couldn't reveal them? What if I told you that in 1945, on a nameless ridge in Okinawa, a single dog uncovered something so disturbing that it forced Allied command to rewrite their entire invasion strategy, and that what happened next was classified for over 30 years? Before we dive into this disturbing story, I need your help. First, comment below and tell me where you're watching from. This channel survives because of viewers like you who care about these hidden truths. Second, hit that subscribe button. YouTube doesn't want you to see this kind of content, and without your support, these stories stay buried forever. Now, let's uncover what really happened on that ridge. The morning of April 19th, 1945, arrived on Okinawa's southern highlands with the kind of silence that made seasoned Marines nervous. First Lieutenant Marcus Delafield of the 3rd Battalion, 29th Marines, crouched behind a shattered limestone outcropping, his Thompson submachine gun trained on the ridgeline 200 yards ahead. The air smelled of cordite, wet earth, and something else, something organic and wrong that he couldn't quite identify. For 6 days, his company had been trying to advance past this particular ridge, a nameless elevation marked only as Hill 372 on their tactical maps. For 6 days, they'd been pushed back by machine gun fire so precise it seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Delafield had seen plenty of defensive positions in his 18 months in the Pacific Theater. He'd crawled through the volcanic sand of Iwo Jima, had watched friends die in the coral caves of Peleliu, but this ridge was different. The Japanese defenders weren't just good, they were invisible. No muzzle flashes, no movement, no indication of where the bullets originated until someone fell. Yesterday alone, Charlie Company had lost 14 men trying to reach the crest. Not one body had been recovered. They'd simply disappeared into the tall grass and never came out. What made it worse was the topology. The ridge wasn't particularly high, maybe 60 feet above the surrounding terrain, but it was positioned like a natural fortress. Steep slopes on 3 sides, covered in dense vegetation and pocked with limestone sinkholes that could hide anything. The 4th side dropped away into a ravine so deep that scouts reported hearing water running somewhere at the bottom, though none had made it far enough to confirm. Command wanted the ridge taken by sunset. They needed the high ground to protect the advance of the 10th Army toward Shuri Castle, the heart of Japanese resistance on the island. That's when Delafield noticed the dog. It appeared from the tree line to their right, a medium-sized animal with a rough brown and white coat, moving with the deliberate caution of something that had learned to survive in a war zone. At first, Delafield thought it might be one of the feral dogs that roamed Okinawa's countryside, descendants of pets abandoned when civilians fled the fighting. But something about its behavior was off. It wasn't scavenging, it wasn't scared, it was searching. Corporal Raymond Hastings, lying prone beside Delafield with his Garand rifle, whispered without taking his eyes off the ridge. "Sir, you seeing what I'm seeing?" The dog. "Yeah, been watching it for about 5 minutes. It's not random, Lieutenant. It's working a pattern." Hastings was right. The dog moved in careful zigzags across the lower slope of the ridge, nose to the ground, occasionally stopping to dig at the soil before moving on. Every few minutes, it would pause, lift its head as if listening, then continue. What struck Delafield as most unusual was that the dog showed no fear of the ridge itself. In 6 days, nothing had moved on that slope without drawing fire. Birds, civilians, Marines, everything died. But the dog worked unmolested, as if it existed in a separate war entirely. "Could be one of ours," Hastings suggested. "Lost from another unit. No collar, no tags." Delafield watched through his binoculars as the dog stopped near a cluster of rocks about halfway up the slope. "And it's not lost. Look at that. It's trained. The dog had begun digging in earnest now, front paws working furiously at loose soil near the base of a large boulder. Even from 200 yards, Delafield could see dirt flying. The animal was committed to whatever it had found, completely focused, despite the sporadic crack of distant rifle fire echoing across the valley. Private First Class Eugene Whitmore, the youngest member of their fire team at just 19 years old, raised a question that had been forming in all their minds. Why isn't anyone shooting at it? The question hung in the humid air. Whitmore was right to ask. The Japanese defenders had been ruthlessly efficient. They'd shot at empty helmets raised on sticks, at shadows that might have been Marines, at anything that moved. Yet this dog worked openly on the slope, visible, vulnerable, and completely ignored. Maybe they're out of ammo, Hastings offered, but his tone suggested he didn't believe it. They've got ammo, Delafield replied. They proved that an hour ago when they cut down that reconnaissance patrol. Sergeant Donald Pritchard crawled forward from where he'd been checking on the rest of the platoon. At 42, he was one of the oldest enlisted men in the company, a veteran of the First World War who'd somehow talked his way back into service. His face was deeply lined, weathered by sun and age and too many campaigns. Captain wants to know if we're going to try another advance before dark. Tell him negative, Delafield said. Not until we figure out what's happening on that ridge. Pritchard followed his lieutenant's gaze to where the dog continued its excavation. That animal's going to get itself killed. That animal's been out there 20 minutes and hasn't drawn a single shot. I want to know why. For the next half hour, the Marines watched in fascinated silence as the dog dug deeper. The hole grew larger, and the animal's behavior became increasingly agitated. It would dig frantically for several minutes, then stop, circle the hole, whine loud enough that the sound carried down the slope, then resume digging with even greater intensity. Whatever it had found wasn't a bone or a piece of rations. This was something that triggered deep instinct, something that frightened and compelled the animal in equal measure. Then the dog stopped. It backed away from the hole, sat down, and began to howl. The sound was unlike anything Delafield had heard from a dog before. It wasn't the howl of pain or hunger or even loneliness. It was a sound of profound distress, almost human in its emotional quality, a keening wail that seemed to compress all the horror of the battlefield into a single sustained note. The howl went on, and in the strange acoustics of the ridge, it seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off rock faces and rolling through ravines. "Jesus Christ," Whitmore whispered. "Make it stop." But the dog didn't stop. It howled for what felt like minutes, but was probably only 30 seconds. And then, with shocking abruptness, it fell silent. It stood up, took several steps away from the hole it had dug, and looked directly at the Marine position. Delafield felt his skin prickle. Through his binoculars, he could see the dog's eyes, dark and intelligent, and fixed on exactly where he lay hidden. It was as if the animal knew precisely where they were, had known all along, and was now trying to communicate something urgent. "It wants us to come look," Hastings said quietly. "That's insane," Pritchard objected. "It's a dog. It doesn't want anything except food and not getting shot." But Delafield wasn't so sure. He'd grown up in rural Montana, had worked with hunting dogs and cattle dogs, and he recognized purposeful behavior when he saw it. This wasn't random animal activity. The dog had found something, had excavated it, had called attention to it, and was now waiting for someone to acknowledge its discovery. The bigger question was whether that someone was supposed to be the Marines or the Japanese defenders who had so conspicuously not shot at it. "I'm going up there," Delafield announced. The response was immediate and unanimous. "Sir, that's suicide," Pritchard said flatly. "That ridge is a killing zone. We've lost too many men already. Which is exactly why we need to know what that dog found. Nothing about this position makes sense, Japanese defenders don't just ignore targets, not unless there's a reason. Delafield checked his pistol, his carbine, his grenades. Something's wrong up there, and that dog just showed us where to look. Then send a scout, Pritchard argued. Send someone expendable. Everyone in this company is expendable according to command, Sergeant, including me. Delafield looked at his watch. It'll be dark in 4 hours. If I'm not back in 2, assume I'm dead and report to Captain Vickers. Before anyone could mount further objection, Delafield rolled out from behind the limestone outcropping and began moving up the slope in a low crouch, his carbine held ready, every nerve screaming that he was about to die. He'd gone maybe 10 yards when he realized Hastings was right behind him. Didn't order you to follow, Corporal. Didn't ask permission, sir. They moved in bounds, one covering while the other advanced, using every scrap of cover the slope offered. The dog watched them come, sitting perfectly still beside its excavation, and with each step closer, Delafield became more convinced that whatever waited in that hole was going to change everything. The grass was taller than it had appeared from below, thick and sharp-edged, cutting at exposed skin. The ground was pocked with shell craters, some old and weathered, others fresh enough that the earth was still raw. Halfway to the dog, they passed what remained of a Marine from an earlier assault, partially covered by vegetation, identified only by the distinctive silhouette of his helmet. Delafield forced himself not to look closely, forced himself to keep moving toward the waiting animal. When they were 30 feet away, the dog stood up. When they were 20 feet away, it wagged its tail once, a brief acknowledgement. When they were 10 feet away, Delafield could see what it had uncovered, and his breath caught in his chest. The hole was roughly circular, perhaps 4 feet in diameter and 3 feet deep. At the bottom, partially exposed by the dog's digging, was wood. Not a tree root or naturally occurring timber, but processed, planed wood, dark with age and dirt. Delafield knelt at the edge of the excavation, Hastings covering him, and used his combat knife to scrape away more soil. "It's a door," Hastings breathed. "There's a goddamn door buried under this ridge." He was right. As more dirt came away, the outline became unmistakable. A trap door, maybe 3 feet square, set into a wooden frame that extended deeper than the dog's excavation had reached. The wood was old, but solid, and when Delafield knocked on it with his knife handle, the sound that came back was hollow. "There's space underneath," he said. "A lot of space." The dog sat down again and whined, softer now, almost relieved, as if it had successfully completed a difficult task and could now rest. Delafield looked at the animal more carefully. Now that he was close, he could see that the dog was in better condition than most strays. Its coat was dirty but not matted, its body lean but not starving. Around its neck, barely visible through the mud and fur, was a faded piece of cloth, perhaps once a collar or marker of some kind. "Japanese war dog?" Hastings suggested. "Maybe. Or it belonged to a civilian." Delafield ran his hand along the edge of the trap door, feeling for a handle or latch. Either way, it knew this was here. Question is, what's down there? That was indeed the question. The Japanese had proven themselves masters of underground warfare throughout the Pacific Campaign. On Iwo Jima, they'd built an entire labyrinth beneath the island's surface, 11 miles of tunnels that turned the battle into a nightmare of close-quarters combat. On Peleliu, caves connected by passages had allowed defenders to move unseen, to appear behind advancing Marines, to survive bombardments that should have killed everything on the surface. Was this another tunnel entrance? A hidden bunker? A supply cache? Or something else entirely? Something that explained why this ridge had been so fiercely defended, why the Japanese had let a dog work unmolested for half an hour, why everyone who'd tried to take this hill had disappeared. Delafield found the handle, a simple iron ring recessed into the wood. He looked at Hastings. "When I lift this, be ready for anything." "Always am, sir." But before Delafield could pull the ring, the dog did something that made both Marines freeze. It stood up, walked around to the other side of the trapdoor, and lay down flat with its head on its paws, directly over the wood, as if trying to prevent them from opening it. The message was unmistakable. Don't open this. Whatever you do, don't look inside. Maybe we should listen to the dog, Hastings said, only half joking. Delafield's hand hovered over the iron ring. Every instinct told him the corporal was right, that opening this door was a mistake, that some things should stay buried. But they were Marines. They had a mission, and command needed this ridge. He pulled the ring. The trapdoor resisted for a moment, held by decades of dirt and moisture, then came free with a groan of stressed wood and rusted hinges. It swung open, revealing a rectangle of perfect darkness, and from that darkness came a smell so overwhelming that both Marines recoiled. It was the smell of death, but not recent death. This was old death, preserved death, the concentrated reek of decomposition trapped in an enclosed space for so long that it had become something else entirely, something that coated the back of the throat and made breathing difficult. Hastings turned away, gagging. Delafield forced himself to lean over the opening, to look down into the darkness. At first, he could see nothing. His eyes needed time to adjust, time to pick out shapes in the faint illumination that spilled through the trap-door. But gradually, forms began to emerge from the shadows, and what Delafield saw made him wish he'd listened to the dog. There were bodies, not just one or two, but dozens, packed into the space below like cordwood, arranged in careful layers that suggested deliberate placement. They were mummified by the dry air of whatever chamber existed beneath the ridge, reduced to leather and bone, but still recognizably human, still identifiable by the tattered remains of clothing, by the personal effects scattered among them. But it was what else he saw that made Lieutenant Marcus Delafield understand why this ridge had been defended so fiercely, why the Japanese hadn't shot at the dog, why every Marine who'd tried to advance had disappeared without trace. This wasn't just a mass grave, it was a feeding pit, and from somewhere deep in the darkness below, something moved. Delafield jerked back from the opening, his hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm. The movement below had been subtle, just a shifting in the shadows, but unmistakable. Something alive was down there among the dead. "Sir?" Hastings had recovered enough to notice his lieutenant's reaction. "What is it?" "Contact below." "Don't know what. Could be rats." But even as he said it, Delafield knew it wasn't rats. The movement had been too large, too deliberate. He pulled a flare from his belt, struck it against his helmet, and dropped it through the opening before either man could think better of it. The magnesium light exploded in the confined space below, throwing everything into sharp crimson relief, and for 3 seconds that would be burned into Delafield's memory for the rest of his life. He saw exactly what Hill 372 had been hiding. The chamber was huge, carved directly into the limestone bedrock of the ridge, its walls showing the marks of hand tools and decades of patient excavation. The bodies they'd seen were only the top layer of a much deeper pit that descended at least 20 feet, filled with the remains of hundreds, perhaps thousands of victims. But it wasn't the bodies that made Delafield's blood turn cold. It was the living, scattered throughout the chamber, moving in the sudden light like disturbed insects, were figures that Delafield's mind initially refused to categorize as human. They were emaciated beyond anything he'd seen, even in the worst of the Pacific fighting, reduced to little more than animated skeletons covered in translucent skin. Their movements were wrong, jerky and angular, as if their bodies no longer quite remembered how joints were supposed to work, and their eyes, reflected in the flare light, showed nothing human at all, just a flat animal hunger that had long since consumed whatever people they might once have been. There were at least a dozen of them visible in the flare's dying light, and as Delafield watched in horror, Several began moving toward the ladder he now noticed leading up to the trap door, climbing with surprising speed despite their condition. "Close it!" Hastings screamed. "Close it now!" Delafield slammed the trap door shut and threw his full weight on top of it, just as something hit from below, with enough force to lift the wood several inches. The dog, which had retreated when they opened the door, now returned and added its weight, pressing down with its front paws, growling deep in its chest. "The latch!" Delafield shouted. "Find something to secure the latch." Hastings scrambled in the dirt, coming up with a thick branch that he jammed through the iron ring, bracing it against the doorframe. The trap door bucked again, harder this time, and they heard sounds from below that might have been voices, or might have been something else, wordless and desperate, and completely mad. For 30 seconds, that felt like hours, the two Marines and the dog held the door down against whatever tried to emerge from beneath. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the assault stopped. The door went still. From below came only silence, as if whatever existed down there had decided to retreat, to wait, to conserve its strength for another opportunity. Delafield rolled off the door, gasping. His hands were shaking badly enough that he had trouble holding his carbine. Beside him, Hastings had gone pale, his eyes wide with shock. "What in the name of God was that, sir?" "I don't know." Delafield's voice came out hoarse. "But we need to get back to the line. We need to report this. Now." They made it back down the slope in half the time it had taken to go up, no longer caring about covering fire or tactical movement, just running in pure animal panic while the dog paced them, staying close as if trying to shepherd them to safety. The Japanese defenders on the ridge didn't fire a single shot. They'd known. They'd known what was under that trap door, and they'd been defending it not to protect their own position, but to keep the Marines from discovering it. Captain Henry Vickers listened to Delafield's report in silence, his expression growing darker with each detail. When the lieutenant finished, Vickers was quiet for a long moment, staring at the map of Hill 372 spread across his field desk. "You're telling me there's a chamber under that ridge full of decomposed bodies and some kind of survivors?" "Yes, sir." "Survivors of what?" "I don't know, sir. But they weren't soldiers. They weren't defenders. They were something else entirely." Vickers looked at Hastings, who nodded confirmation. "It's true, sir. Every word. I saw them, too." The captain ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration Delafield had seen before when Vickers was dealing with information that didn't fit any tactical framework. "The Japanese have been conducting experiments. We've had reports from China, from the Philippines, medical experiments, biological research, things that violate every convention of warfare." "This felt older than that, sir," Delafield said carefully. "That chamber, the excavation, it wasn't recent. The wood on that trapdoor was decades old at least." "So, what are you suggesting? That this has nothing to do with the current war?" "I'm suggesting we need specialists, sir. Intelligence, maybe medical personnel. And we need to secure that ridge before whatever's down there finds another way out." What Delafield didn't say, what he couldn't quite articulate even to himself, was the feeling he'd gotten in those 3 seconds of flare light. This wasn't just a war crime or an abandoned horror from some earlier conflict. There had been something organized about that chamber, something purposeful about its construction and maintenance, and the way those figures had moved toward the ladder, the speed and coordination despite their condition, suggested they'd done it many times before. Vickers made his decision. "I'm calling this in to battalion. In the meantime, you're going to take a squad back up there at first light with demolition equipment. If we can't understand what's in that hole, we're going to seal it, permanently." But when dawn came on April 20th, the situation had changed in ways none of them could have predicted. The first indication that something was wrong came when Sergeant Pritchard arrived at Delafield's position with a report that made no tactical sense. During the night, Japanese forces had withdrawn from Hill 372 entirely. Scouts had moved up the slopes at 0300 hours expecting fierce resistance and had found only abandoned positions, empty foxholes, and weapons left behind in a haste that suggested panic rather than ordered retreat. The ridge was theirs. After 6 days of brutal fighting, the Japanese had simply given it up. "They ran," Pritchard said, his voice carrying a mix of relief and confusion. "Just packed up and ran like the devil himself was chasing them." "Or like they were running from something," Delafield replied, remembering the silence that had followed their discovery of the trapdoor, the way no one had fired at them as they fled down the slope. The squad Delafield led back up Hill 372 in the gray light of morning consisted of 12 Marines, including combat engineers carrying enough explosives to collapse whatever existed beneath the ridge. The dog from the previous day appeared from the tree line as they began their ascent, falling into step beside them as if it had been waiting. Private Whitmore, who'd been assigned to the detail despite his youth, eyed the animal nervously. "That dog's strange, Lieutenant. The way it acts, it's like it understands things." "Maybe it does," Delafield replied. "Maybe it's seen things that gave it knowledge our training never covered." They found the trapdoor exactly where they'd left it, the branch still jammed through the iron ring, undisturbed. But the ground around it had changed. Fresh scratch marks covered the earth in a wide circle, as if something had clawed at the soil from below, trying to find another way out. And there were tracks, dozens of them, leading away from the site in multiple directions, disappearing into the dense vegetation of the ridge. Corporal James Holloway, one of the engineers, knelt to examine the tracks. Barefoot, human-sized, but the spacing is wrong, like whoever made them wasn't walking normally. "They're spreading out," Hastings observed grimly. "Looking for other exits, maybe, or hunting." Delafield made his decision quickly. "Holloway, set your charges. I want that chamber collapsed before noon. The rest of you, form a perimeter. Shoot anything that moves that isn't one of ours." While the engineers worked on placing explosives around the trapdoor and in several spots where the ground sounded hollow when struck, suggesting the chamber extended beyond the immediate area, Delafield took the opportunity to examine the abandoned Japanese positions more closely. What he found troubled him deeply. The foxholes and bunkers on the ridge's crest were well constructed and strategically positioned, exactly what one would expect from Japanese defenders. But inside several of the positions, Delafield found things that made no tactical sense. Chains attached to support posts, locks on the inside of firing ports, restraints that could only have been meant to hold human beings in place. In one bunker, he found a journal written in Japanese, its pages filled with cramped handwriting and crude sketches. Delafield couldn't read the text, but the drawings were clear enough. They showed the ridge in cross-section, with the chamber beneath and tunnels extending outward like roots from a diseased tree. The drawings showed figures in the chamber, but also figures in the tunnels, and figures emerging at night to hunt in the jungle. And in the final pages of the journal, the drawings became less organized, more frantic. They showed the same figures, but now with additional details that suggested the artist had been trying to record something he didn't fully understand. The proportions were wrong in these later sketches, the limbs too long, the joints bending in directions that anatomy shouldn't allow. And in the last drawing, dated 2 days earlier, the artist had simply drawn a single massive character in bold strokes that took up the entire page. Delafield didn't need to read Japanese to understand what it meant. The character conveyed pure terror in its violent application. "Lieutenant, Private First Class." Kenneth Morrison's shout brought Delafield running. Morrison was positioned on the eastern edge of the perimeter, his rifle pointed down the slope. Movement in the trees, multiple contacts. Delafield followed his sightline and saw them. Figures moving through the jungle below, visible only as pale flashes between dark vegetation. They moved fast, faster than any human should be able to move through terrain that thick. and they moved in a coordinated pattern that suggested either military training or pack behavior. "How many?" Delafield demanded. "Dozen, maybe more. Hard to get a count when they move like that." The dog began barking. Not the aggressive bark of a guard animal, but the urgent, warning bark of something that recognized danger. It positioned itself between the Marines and the slope, hackles raised, every muscle tense. "Holloway," Delafield called. "How long on those charges?" 20 minutes, sir. These need to be placed precisely if we want full collapse." "You've got 10. After that, we blow what we have and fall back." But the figures in the jungle had other plans. As Delafield watched, they changed direction, moving not away from the Marine position but toward it, beginning to climb the slope with a speed that defied the difficult terrain. And now he could hear them, a sound like nothing he'd encountered in 18 months of war, a chorus of voices that might once have been human but had degraded into something else, something that expressed pain and hunger and rage in equal measure. "Weapons free," Delafield ordered. "Anyone sees a target, take it." The first rifle shot came from Morrison's position, followed immediately by a dozen more as the Marines opened fire on the advancing figures. Delafield saw one of them fall, saw it tumble down the slope, but the others didn't slow. If anything, they accelerated, using the dense vegetation and the slope's natural contours for cover, with an efficiency that spoke of long practice. One of them broke from cover 40 yards away, and Delafield got his first clear look at what they were facing in daylight. It had once been human, still wore the tattered remains of what might have been civilian clothing, but its body had been reshaped by starvation and something else, something that had hollowed out everything human and replaced it with pure survival instinct. Its eyes were blank white, either blind or adapted to the darkness of the chamber, and its mouth hung open in a permanent grimace that showed teeth filed or worn to points. Hastings put 3 rounds into its chest, and it kept coming, only stopping when a shot from Pritchard's rifle took it in the head and dropped it instantly. "Head shots only," Pritchard bellowed. "Body shots don't stop them." The Marines formed a tight defensive circle as more of the creatures emerged from the jungle. There were dozens of them now, maybe more, climbing from multiple directions, and Delafield realized with sick certainty that the chamber beneath the ridge had been only one entrance to something much larger. These things had been living under this hill, possibly for years, possibly for decades, coming out at night to hunt, retreating before dawn to the safety of their underground warren. The Japanese hadn't been defending the ridge. They'd been containing it. Holloway and his engineers worked frantically to finish placing charges, while the rest of the squad provided covering fire. The creatures were learning, adapting their approach, using suppressive movement that would have impressed Delafield if it hadn't been so terrifying. They'd rush forward in groups of 3 or 4, forcing the Marines to shift fire, while others advanced from different angles. The dog was in the thick of it, darting forward to snap at any creature that got too close, then retreating before they could respond. It fought with the intelligence of an animal that had survived by understanding these things, that had learned their patterns and weaknesses through long exposure. "Charges set!" Holloway shouted. 60-second fuse. "Everyone back!" Delafield ordered. "Double time to the base of the slope." The Marines retreated in good order, laying down covering fire as they moved, the dog racing ahead to lead them. Behind them, Holloway struck the fuse and ran, his heavy equipment pack bouncing on his back. The creatures seemed to understand that something was wrong, their advance becoming more frenzied, more desperate. The squad made it 30 yards down the slope when the charges detonated. The sound was tremendous, a deep crump that seemed to come from inside the earth itself, followed by the rumble of collapsing rock and earth. The ridgetop simply disappeared, falling into itself as the chamber beneath gave way, taking the trap door and the surrounding area down into a crater 50 feet across. The effect on the creatures was immediate and dramatic. Those that had been pursuing the Marines stopped as if struck, their heads turning back toward the ridgetop, and then they began screaming. The sound was so human, so filled with loss and anguish, that several of the Marines actually flinched. It was the sound of something being torn from home, from safety, from the only place they knew, and then they scattered, breaking in all directions, disappearing into the jungle with the same unnatural speed they'd shown climbing the slope. Within seconds, the hillside was empty, except for the handful of bodies that hadn't made it back to cover in time. "Did we get them all?" Whitmore asked, his voice shaking. "No," Delafield replied, staring at the crater where the ridgetop had been. "We just destroyed their nest. They're still out there, somewhere in this jungle, and now they have no place to go." The official report filed by Captain Vickers that afternoon was brief and heavily sanitized. It noted that Hill 372 had been secured with minimal casualties, that enemy forces had withdrawn during the night, and that demolition had been used to collapse suspected tunnel networks that might have been used for future defensive positions. There was no mention of bodies in a chamber, no description of what the Marines had encountered. But Delafield knew the truth would spread anyway, the way truth always did among combat troops. By nightfall, every Marine in the 3rd Battalion had heard some version of what happened on the ridge. The story would grow, would change, would become a legend told in foxholes and rest areas until no one could quite remember what was real and what was embellishment. What Delafield couldn't know, not then, was how the investigation that followed would unfold. How intelligence officers would arrive within 48 hours to examine the crater, to interview the squad, to collect samples and take photographs that would be classified for the next 30 years. He couldn't know that he would be ordered to sign documents swearing him to secrecy, that his official service record would be altered to remove any mention of April 19th and 20th, 1945. He couldn't know that other Marines would report similar encounters elsewhere on Okinawa, always at night, always involving figures that moved wrong and fought with desperate ferocity, or that civilians returning to their villages after the battle would speak in whispers of the old places, the forbidden places, where certain families had lived for generations and where no one with sense would venture after dark. In the weeks that followed, as the battle for Okinawa ground toward its bloody conclusion, the 3rd Battalion moved south toward Shuri Castle, leaving Hill 372 behind. But Delafield thought about it every day, thought about what they'd found in that chamber, about the creatures they'd driven from their nest, about where those creatures might have gone. The dog stayed with the unit. No one officially adopted it, but it moved with Charlie Company as they advanced, sleeping near the command post, accepting food from the Marines, seeming to understand that it had cast its lot with these humans rather than the things it had lived among under the ridge. The men called it Scout, and it proved its worth a dozen times over in the fighting that followed, alerting them to ambushes, finding wounded men in the darkness, exhibiting an intelligence that went far beyond normal animal behavior. On the night of June 7th, 3 weeks before the battle for Okinawa officially ended, Delafield was awakened by Scout's low growling. The dog stood at the entrance to his shelter, staring out into the darkness, every muscle rigid with tension. Delafield grabbed his carbine and moved to investigate, and in the distance, perhaps a quarter-mile away, he saw lights moving through the jungle. Not flashlights or lanterns, but the scattered glow of dozens of luminescent eyes reflecting the quarter moon as they passed between trees. They were hunting, still alive, still surviving, adapted now to life in the open jungle rather than their underground warren. And they were moving south, following the same route the Marines were taking, staying just beyond contact range, waiting for opportunities that might never come or that might arrive when least expected. Delafield watched until the lights disappeared, then returned to his shelter. He didn't report what he'd seen. There was no point. The war was nearly over. The island was almost secured, and command had made clear they wanted no more reports about Hill 372 or anything connected to it. But he knew, and Scout knew, and probably 100 other Marines knew, that something had been released on Okinawa that spring, something that would not easily be contained again, something that would become part of the island's ecology, another predator in a place that had seen too much death already. The war ended. Delafield returned to Montana, married his sweetheart Sarah, had 3 children, and never spoke of what happened on that ridge, not even to his wife, not even in his final days when age and illness had loosened many tongues. He kept the silence he'd sworn to keep, the secret he'd been ordered to protect. But late at night, in the last years of his life, Delafield would sometimes wake from dreams of darkness and climbing things, of chambers beneath the earth and figures that moved wrong. And he would lie awake wondering if the creatures from Hill 372 were still out there, somewhere in Okinawa's jungles, or caves, or forgotten places, surviving as they'd always survived, waiting as they'd always waited, patient in the way that only the truly desperate can be patient. Scout lived with the Delafield family until 1958, growing old with dignity, protecting the children, maintaining the same intelligence and loyalty it had shown in the war. When it died, Delafield buried it in the backyard with full honors, and if he shed tears over the grave of a dog that had once led him to horrors beneath a ridge in Okinawa, there was no shame in that. The official records of what happened on Hill 372 remain classified. The photographs, the samples, the testimony of 12 Marines who saw things they couldn't explain, all locked away in archives that the public will likely never access. The historians who write about the Battle of Okinawa mention the hill only in passing, noting it as a minor tactical objective taken with minimal resistance in the 3rd week of the campaign. But the people of Okinawa remember. In the villages near where Hill 372 once stood, before it was leveled and developed in the decades after the war, old people still tell stories. They speak of the Yamahito, the mountain people, the ones who lived below before there were cities, before there was civilization, the ones who were driven underground by progress and daylight and the world changing around them. They speak of families that vanished, of travelers who never arrived at their destinations, of sounds in the night that no animal makes. And they speak of how the war disturbed something that should have stayed hidden, how the explosions and the death and the chaos of battle shook loose things that had been contained for generations. Maybe it's just folklore. Maybe it's just the way traumatized people process incomprehensible violence. Or maybe, deep in the limestone caves that honeycomb Okinawa's interior, in places where no tourist goes and no developer builds, there are still chambers where things that were once human remember being something else, and wait for darkness, and hunger for a world they lost when the ridge collapsed, and drove them into exile. In the end, we can't know. The truth is buried under decades of secrecy, under layers of official denial, and missing records and testimony dismissed as combat fatigue. What we can know is that 12 Marines saw something on Hill 372 in April of 1945 that changed them forever, that made them keep secrets even from those they loved, and that haunted them until their deaths. And we can know that sometimes, in war, the enemy you can see and fight is not the most terrifying thing you might encounter. Sometimes the real horror is what you find when you dig too deep, when you uncover what was meant to stay hidden, when you disturb rest that was never peaceful to begin with. In these dark times, when the world seems full of hidden evils and buried secrets, when we discover that human beings are capable of horrors we can barely imagine, there is only one true refuge, only one source of light that can penetrate the deepest darkness. That light is found in faith, in turning to God and to Jesus Christ, who offers salvation not through human strength or understanding, but through grace and truth. The men who fought on Hill 372, who witnessed what lay beneath that ridge, learned something that all of us must eventually face. There are powers in this world beyond our control, beyond our understanding, and in confronting them we discover how small we truly are, how desperately we need something greater than ourselves to make sense of the darkness. Turn to God. Turn to Jesus Christ. In Him alone is the power to face whatever horrors this world contains, to find peace in the midst of chaos, to discover hope even when standing at the edge of an abyss. The secrets of Hill 372 may remain buried, but the truth of salvation is available to anyone who seeks it.